Okay, so buon dia, benvenuto. And we will see if other people will join us. Okay, so this morning we have Marko from Brazil. He's an old friend. Most of you already met him yesterday. He will be around this week. So Marko is, we met when we were working in RRI practice, and European projects focus on responsible innovation practices, and he's based in Campinas, which is the second top ranked university in Brazil. No?
Yes.
According to him, it's the first one.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, so he's an anthropologist working in a very hostile department, I would say, no? Not hostile, dominated by
Sometimes hostile.
Sometimes hostile. Dominated by people working on innovation studies, economics, and but your department is geology, right?
Is science and technology policy.
Science. But you are also
The
working with
Institute
geology.
of Geosciences. So there's geology, geography, and teaching of geosciences.
Yeah.
As well.
Okay, so we share a number of research interests, and especially what's generally called STS. And so today, Marko is going to work a project that is just about to start, right? And it's in the based in the middle of the Amazon. And okay, so as usual, you will have between 30 and 40 minutes. Don't worry, I will not stop. And then we will have a discussion between us and the people that are connecting online. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation. Just before I start, this is the first time I'm presenting this, so I'm kind of testing out and I'm publishing a version of this in a cultural anthropology section, cultural anthropology. So I'm also kind of beginning to develop the ideas because this project, the Amazon Face project that I'm going to speak about, I want to study the project, but I'm also part of the project. So I'm part of the scientific steering committee of the project, and I'm going to talk about that towards the end. So I'm a participant. Also, I want to do an ethnography of the scientific project, its consequences. And I realize not everybody here is working in these kinds of topics or methodologies, but I hope we can exchange ideas. And thank you so much, Mario, for bringing me here.
Not everybody, but
Pontevedra.
some are.
Some are, okay, great. So I hope it speaks to some of you, and this is interesting. If you have questions also about the Science Policy Department, I'm the coordinator of the postgraduate studies in the Institute. So I'm supposed to know everything about the postgraduate studies in that institute. I'm very involved in the graduate program, even though I'm the only anthropologist. So for today, I want to talk about this Amazon Face project. I'm going to explain what the project is, what it's supposed to be doing. And basically, it's a project to try in a very, in a sentence, it wants to see how the Amazon forest will react to increased CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's the basic idea. But it has to do also with rain patterns, with soil, if the carbon is going to be stuck in the soil somehow, if the species are going to change. So there's a whole bunch of variables they want to test. And I want to look at this as an experimental system, as this concept of experimental system, to understand what that means for the Amazon forest, for science policy in Brazil, for science diplomacy, for the ideas of climate change that will emerge from this. So I based off the experiment. I don't want to just do an ethnography of production of knowledge, which is something very classic in SCS, but I want also to always take that system and try to see the connections between politics and environmental policies in Brazil and adaptation policies and what kinds of futures that people foresee for the forest, for climate change in the country. Also, I want to, if we have time, discuss a little bit about the role for social science in these kinds of projects. It's something I'm always kind of involved in. I've done ethnographies of other large-scale environmental projects before. So I'm kind of always in that position of being the only social scientist, the only person in humanities working with a lot of natural scientists. So that's a position that we can reflect on. What kinds of understandings they have of social science, how social science participates in the scientific production and decision-making of these projects. So what is FACE? What is that technology? FACE is free air carbon enrichment. So they fumigate CO2 in plants. There's a whole history to this. Since the 20s, they used to do this for agriculture. They thought they were fertilizing plants. So increased CO2 would increase yields. They detected this in the field and they were testing this as a technique for agriculture. Then it kind of shifted towards a testing of how, an atmosphere with more CO2 would impact plants. The Department of Energy in the US in the 80s invested a lot of money in building large FACE experiments to understand the role of increased CO2. And then it kind of abandoned those kinds of experiments. And then recently they became again, there rose an interest in Brazil to do a first FACE experiment in a tropical forest, because they are usually done in forests in the Northern Hemisphere, in the US, in Europe. There's a FACE in Australia where, there's very, it's always one dominant species, sometimes just one species in a forest. Climate conditions are very different. And I was telling Mario, in one plot in the Amazon, there's 400 species of plants, just in one circle, which is a very different environment than Europe. So they want to see how this technology would work in the forest, what kind of science can be done there. They want to assess how carbon behaves within the forest, how that impacts the leaves, the photosynthesis, also the roots, the soil cycles. And it's a very large endeavor. So it's interesting in itself because it's the largest Brazil-UK scientific cooperation initiative. It involves the University of Campinas and IPA, the National Institute of Amazonian Research, and a bunch of partners from other countries from the US and Europe. It started to be kind of idealized in 2013, but just recently the infrastructure actually got built because the UK actually came in with the money, with millions of pounds, and said, we want to invest in this. It is a priority for the UK to invest in science about the Amazon, about climate science. So again, you can see as this project becomes materialized, as the experiment is materialized, it kind of moves all these actors in Brazil and outside of Brazil, which makes it an interesting case of study. So this is a model of what the plot would look like. This is a computer-generated image. So all these towers would fumigate carbon within the space of the trees, just so we understand what the technology looks like. Rich Norby is part of the Amazon FACE, and he's one of the kind of creators of this scientific experiment. And they want to do 6 plots, 3 of them fumigating CO2, 3 control, just to see how each plot would behave. And the idea was to build this in the Amazon, in a experimental site. So this is where the experiment is actually located. It's actually 60 kilometers, not 30 kilometers like I was saying. So Manaus is a very large city, capital of the state of Amazonas. You drive 60 kilometers to the ZF2 site. So INPA, this institute, has a piece of land over there where they have developed many studies. They have towers to detect the CO2 levels and other variables. So there's a tradition of studying forests, of building towers, and that would be where the plots would be built within the site. Just so we have an idea. So that's the ZF2 site, 60 kilometers northwest of Manaus, and it's supposed to kind of mimic a pristine forest, so away from urban centers with no pollution. That's why it makes it an interesting site to do these kinds of experiments. And this is the actual view from the field. I took this picture actually on top of one of those cranes. So it looks very similar to the models. And they managed to build 2 of these plots. And these towers are like 35 meters tall. And the cranes are supposed to allow you to study the top of the trees. So there's all kinds of variations to the science where the leaves in the bottom behave differently than the leaves on the top. And this is, I think, the second, it's the first space experiment in a tropical forest, but I think only Panama has one of those cranes to study the top of the leaves. So it represents kind of a whole set of new infrastructures that will enable the scientists to do kind of cutting edge science about the Amazon, about photosynthesis, about carbon cycling, etc. This is a picture I took from the bottom in one of those visits. And I want to talk about kind of the spectacle that they make of the whole infrastructure as a strategy to kind of validate the experiment and mobilize political support and scientific support. This is also a picture taken from one of the cranes. So during one of those visits, they usually take the visitors to, make them go to the crane, take them up, and you can see the forest from above, which is also an experience in itself to show people like, oh, this is the vast expanse of the Amazon. This is what the whole science is all about. And it becomes kind of discursively constructed as this, the Amazon as this symbolic entity that needs to be understood and has a central role in climate and environment. And I wanted, the first, I was involved in the project in 2019. They were looking for social scientists to kind of compose a social economic aspect, a working package, but there was no infrastructure, there was no experiment. So we were just kind of discussing, and then COVID came and we got demobilized. I did another project with them about food safety. So we went to the Amazon, we did field work. And in 2023, the actual infrastructure became a reality. So now we're discussing the start of the experiment. So I thought this is the best time to start looking at ethnographically the project, because it's literally beginning to be developed and I can kind of see the development through the years. So my idea is to actually get funding and do a proper ethnography and kind of follow these scientists. And I'm already not the only one. There's another person who's already got a paper published on face experiments. And she sent me the paper, and we're discussing how to do this, how to cooperate. So my first kind of attempt to theorize this is through the idea of experimental system. So Hans-Georg Reinberger is a German historian of science, and I think this idea of experimental system is an interesting way to theorize the relevance of looking at these huge open air experimental setups. So in science, when we look at scientific practice, we're not looking at, as everybody knows, everybody that's interested in STS, science is not just a revelation of reality. Hi. So glad you made it. So getting back to this, of course, a laboratory study or a laboratory setup is not just a scientist, disinterested science looking at reality and revealing truth about reality. The very setup, the material setup of an experiment is a unit of analysis. So the practical production of knowledge involves the scientists, involves the experiments, involves the whole assemblage of these things and how they relate to each other. So looking at it as a unit of analysis, the experimental system is, I think, an interesting way, even though it's not a very small scale experiment. Reinberger was looking at protein synthesis. It's a very large scale experiment, but I think some of these ways of theorizing very much apply, especially in the way of producing a certain experimental reasoning about the trees, the forest, the carbon, about the soil, the way the experiment produces new experimental objects, and the way it produces difference and produces the future. So an experimental setup produces difference in the sense that an experiment that is that's successful produces new knowledge, produces unexpected knowledge, things that we don't know before we start the experiment. So producing difference is what a good experiment is supposed to be. But he talks about a machine for making the future because it produces new questions that can be answered through the experiment. And that is where I think this is a very interesting instance to look at, because the way that they enable carbon to become measurable in a specific way makes climate change amenable to a specific kinds of analysis, and makes biodiversity, social interactions, adaptations, to be able to be studied in specific ways that would be impossible before the experiment was set up. So it not only produces the future for the science of the Amazon, but also, I'm assuming, and this is my hypothesis, it will produce certain kinds of possibilities for policy, for scientific diplomacy, for climate policy, environmental policy. And I want to follow the science, especially to see if that's actually the case, how they will interact with policy, how they will interact with other scientists and authorities. They're very much attuned to the global discussion about the environment, about climate. They want to do, for example, they presented a model of the experiment at the last conference of parts in Dubai. So they're already kind of selling the idea that the FACE experiment will enable new discussions on the environment, on climate change. There's going to be a conference in Belém in, I think, next year. So they want to be there also to kind of interact with these different actors. And so I think that's one way to look at how an experimental system produces not just the future for the science about the Amazon, but the future or futures of the Amazon as an entity that is seen as relevant for the whole of the planet, for climate change worldwide, for not just regional patterns of rain, which affect agriculture, but also regional and global patterns of climate and the carbon stock, the world's carbon stock, which is a crucial question for scientists interested in climate change. So again, just reiterating what I just said, as a large experimental system, it produces, also it's a hypothesis. I think it will have a great impact just because of the scale, specific forms of climate change. So it will enable specific questions to be asked about climate change in different ways that were impossible before, and also about the human impacts or the human interactions between humans and biodiversity, humans and the already ongoing climate change that you can already see happening, the adaptations. And it may be, and I think the whole experience is based on this, what some people call carbon reductionism, the idea that carbon is the main variable to be analyzed, and it would explain most of the problems around climate change. So climate change, of course, is a very multivariable problem, but most science, a lot of the science in this kind of experiment specifically is very much focused on the carbon stock. So how much carbon is fixed in the trees, how much carbon goes in the roots, how much carbon will affect photosynthesis, and that would supposedly give answers about bigger questions about the climate. And also it reinforces climate reductionism, where the future, the idea that the climate and the changing climate is one of the major, if not the major issue to be tackled in the future of humanity, of the planet. So of course, I'm using the idea of co-production here in terms of thinking how the experiment will possibly, it's a hypothesis I wanted to test, possibly co-produce specific forms of policy not only environmental policy, but science policy, scientific diplomacy, the idea of how cooperation works between Brazil and the UK, Brazil and other countries, and other policies that that we don't know yet. Maybe like if they're interested in biodiversity and food safety, how would that impact policies? If they detect specific species becoming more dominant, less dominant in the plot, would that imply that this would possibly affect the whole of the forest? Depends on modeling, and that could impact other kinds of policies. And also it reinforces the idea that the Amazon is the major Okay. And the Amazon becomes the major issue Brazil uses in its dealings with the outside and its negotiations with other countries. This has become again the focus when Lula was elected again. How will Brazil kind of enter the Green New Deal or all these discussions around environmental problems? And Brazil wants to regain the status of being a protagonist in global environmental discussions, climate discussions, and the Amazon becomes kind of capital to be used in these negotiations. So I think Amazon Face builds and enters into relation with this kind of tradition of using the Amazon as a major form of political capital, scientific capital. So there's all kinds of questions that open up, I think, in my engagement with the project. I'm not really sure which one will be the more productive or the more interesting, but I'm thinking about how to make this, which are the more interesting questions to be asked. Of course, I always refer back to Latour's classic essay, The Pedophile of Boa Vista, which also deals with open air experiments or the production of a laboratory setting within the forest. And he already mentions in there the kind of controversy between what's happening to the forest. Is it becoming a savanna? Is the savanna advancing? Is the forest advancing? How would that, how is that answerable through experiments? And how natural objects become epistemic objects? How through transformations from soil to then soil samples and then to graphs, and that how that circulates from Brazil to France to other countries. So an experiment is much more than, of course, producing knowledges. It is about producing relations, producing what Latour calls immutable mobiles that travel between, maintaining their internal coherence and internal characteristics, and enable relations that are beyond science. And I think Amazon Face, goes in conversation with these kinds of analyses of how the Amazon becomes an epistemic object in specific ways, but it produces relationships in science, policy, and diplomacy, in economics, in agriculture, and all kinds of other realms of reality. Like I was saying, the experiment is also a spectacle, and these scientists use this actively to engage with other actors, to engage with politicians, with authorities, and they perform publicly this large scaleness of the project, and the way they show people around and they show the experiment and they make people see the forest from above. The aerial view, the view from above kind of plays into this imagination of this endless pristine forest that is a kind of a richness of Brazilians that we needs protection, and it also plays a role in global climate, and also to the idea of Brazil kind of holding this unending richness. And so again, it plays into that production of the Amazon as a entity in itself. So the science about climate kind of reinforces the idea that Amazon can be looked at as a system that has a very important role in regional climate patterns, regional rain patterns. So there's talk about flying rivers, that the moisture from the Amazon kind of helps the southeast of Brazil not become a desert. And that could change if the Amazon changes. There's the whole tipping point hypothesis. If you keep destroying the Amazon past a certain point, it will kind of undergo cascading effects and become a savanna. That's one of the ways people theorize what could happen, and that could have disastrous cascading effects within South America and beyond. And that hypothesis helps to kind of, again, give scientific credibility and convince people to invest millions of pounds, millions of dollars into this kind of infrastructure. This is just to show the recent developments. You know, how did this get built? Mainly because the UK with the Met Office kind of put invested money, and that prompted the Ministry of Science of Brazil to, again, not to stay behind, also pledge money. So there's a whole backstage of negotiations between the PI in Campinas, the PI in Manaus, and to enable the investment to be made in the project. This is a picture of the former UK Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, visiting the Amazon face site. On his left is Davila Paula, the PI from Campinas, which is the person that contacted me early on. He's no longer the Foreign Secretary, but when he was, he visited the site as the Foreign Secretary. So there's a whole kind of spectacle done to bring him. This was before even the towers got built. He went up one of the towers. He made a lot of videos, a lot of pictures. So it was a performance also for the UK public, for the global public, about the UK's involvement in Amazon science. And this is Cleverly with Luciano Santos, the Brazilian Minister of Science and Innovation. So the British have invested around 12.3 million reais, the Brazilian reais, or 7.3 pounds. And the Science Ministry has also invested a similar amount. This is just to build the towers. So what the challenge is now is to get access to more funding to get the CO2 running. So it's a very, again, long-term, large-scale project that is still, rushing to enable itself. And it's interesting also to see, like, why would people spend that much money to keep this experiment running in such a scale? Do you want
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Is that investment a carbon pardon? Does the UK investing in that as a project offset its emissions?
Don't think so. This is funding related to development
Okay.
projects. So I think they see it as development. Because also they're putting carbon in the forest, not offsetting.
Yeah. Okay.
Offsetting carbon. So again, there's a lot of literature on the science agenda for the Amazon. Like I was saying, many people have been studying the role of the Amazon in the science policy about the climate. So how the Amazon became kind of a central entity in understanding global climate, and that enables also, like I was saying, the way Brazil has used the Amazon as capital to negotiate in environmental forums and foreign negotiations also works together with this kind of the big science projects being built in the Amazon. This Amazon face builds on the LBA, the Large Biosphere Atmosphere Project, which used to be the largest experiment about the Amazon. And it enabled a lot of people to get, their master's, their PhD, and a lot of these people have been what's that called? Hired by Amazon Face to work. So it has been a decades-long building of this infrastructure, the human infrastructure, and the now the material, the tower infrastructure to continue this tradition of building science about the Amazon. And it's not the only large-scale project. This is the other very large, very tall tower, and it's called the Amazon Tall Tower Observatory, which is another big science project, which is funded by Germany. In this case, it's also used by Germans as a way to kind of showcase how Germany is interested and invested in producing science about sustainability, about the climate, about the Amazon. It's very impressive. It's taller than the Eiffel Tower. And you can find a lot of media articles in the UK and Europe about this tall tower. And again, it's interesting to look at how these big science projects about the Amazon produce the spectacle of the huge scale of both the forest and the big science being built around it. The tipping point. So this is a cover of one of the latest issues of Nature. That article is co-authored by La Pola, and it again brings back the idea of the tipping point. So it's not a new idea. It's since the 90s, people have been saying, you know, could the Amazon reach a tipping point and become something else, kind of lose its equilibrium as a forest, become stable as a savanna. And that has kind of made a comeback in scientific and political discussions about the Amazon. Could we reach a tipping point somewhere in the future? That's again part of the production of imaginaries of the future that I'm interested in following. What kinds of imaginaries are being constructed? Where are they being produced? And how will they affect the present? That's something I'm very interested in, how the present is kind of built around these futures through scientific reasoning, through political imagination, through these interactions between scientists and other actors through the media. And there's a whole bunch to be said about how the Amazon captures the imagination of people outside of Brazil as well, since the 80s. This is a picture from that article, kind of explaining the different factors that could lead to a tipping point. So timber extraction, burning of the forest, edge effects, where you have spots of forest isolated, and effects in the edge, and extreme droughts. So we already see kind of changing climates affecting people, affecting the biodiversity. So, like I said, the Amazon face has built on existing imaginaries and traditions in science policy in the way it focuses on the role of carbon and the forest. So it kind of continues and deepens this tradition. The idea of a tipping point is a way to base this and give it credibility. And I'm talking about here the will to model, the idea that we can model, that we should model all of these variables is another drive to build these projects. So a lot of the data that is being produced is being fed into a model being developed in Campinas. They want to better model so they want to produce coupled model of vegetation, climate, and maybe social variables, human social variables. And the modeling, the role of models in also producing those futures is a question that I want to pursue, if possible, in this project. And so that's what the Amazon face is. That's some of the questions that they, I think, that are possible to make for those. And, you know, what kind of role can social scientists have in these kinds of settings? And I've been involved in other ethnographies of large-scale collaborative projects. And I'm usually the only, if not sometimes there's me and another one, social scientist in a community of natural scientists. That's a very kind of challenging position to be in because, well, before I had no say, no citizenship to say anything. I was just kind of looking, studying, they would interact with me. In this case, I'm actually part of the science committee, the steering committee. So it's a different kind of legitimacy that I have. Yet I'm still the only social science person, even within the. So the story, the first science plan did not even include social science or socioeconomic. They talked about it, but they wanted to kind of build it. That's why they got me in. Now we did a revision of the science plan. They actually inserted a working package for social environmental issues. So there is kind of a space for this, but it's always kind of seen through ecology lenses. And that's another thing that I want to delve more deeply into. And I've written a lot about this, how interdisciplinary cooperation works and doesn't work, how misunderstandings kind of are productive in enabling certain knowledges to be built, to be produced. Usually social science is always subordinate to other kinds of knowledges. I have a student that just finished an ethnography of the Amazon face before, of course, all this got built, and he was talking about how, there's no social science component. They were just talking about it as something that they wanted to build. But again, as a full member of the steering committee, I have a lot more legitimacy now to bring the topic into. So I have participated in the whole revision of the science plan, and I haven't, because of this, there's questions related to social science that are present in the plan, and those maybe would be answered if there was no social science person in this. But the way that we kind of resolve this transition from socioeconomic to socio-environmental is a negotiation between me and the other ecologists kind of components that are part of the component, because the idea of ecosystem services are the main lens through which the human variable is seen as important to the whole project. So people think of the forest as producing or providing services. So there's a whole capitalistic lens through which everything's seen, not just the carbon reductionism, but the idea of service, and that capital can kind of be a way to understand how things go in and out, and inputs and outputs. And so the benefits of these trees standing out. When I see him explain the project to the rector, to other people, he always talks he always talks about the benefits provided by the tree. So the trees kind of hold carbon. That's a very clear, always talked about benefit. And there's other benefits that the trees provide: biodiversity, food, medicine, well-being. So there's a whole language of ecosystem services that kind of frames how they see human impacts or human importance in the project. There's all kinds of things that get left out. So other knowledges, indigenous people, or even a reflexive look into how the project itself may be just the wrong way to go in understanding the forest and climate. But again, it's a negotiation, and the negotiation has to go through how they perceive humans, and ecosystem services is a way that they understand humans as relevant to the issues of understanding carbon and soil and water in the Amazon. So it opened up a door, but again, it always kind of conditions how we can ask social scientific questions. I remember I mentioned in one of these meetings that I wanted to do an ethnography of the project. They were like, it's something I've always encountered. I've done this for like 20 years between my PhD and other projects. People always feel like taken aback, like what does that mean? Like, you going to observe us? Are you going to tell us what to do or interfere? Even though I'm their peer and part of the steering committee, the idea that someone's there like looking at them, making them the object is always still problematic. And in one article, I said that we should dispute, not just study these projects, but dispute and participate in how they produce the knowledge, how they define the objectives, and how they interpret the actual results. Because in these large-scale projects, usually it's always a negotiation. It's always a debate, even though it's about experts and how they see. So the messages that come out, the science messages and the political messages are all, inherently political because they are disputed between all these actors. And we're usually absent. We, meaning social scientists, are usually absent from this because they're seen as essentially biological systems or systems that have to be studied through hard science. And I wrote back in 2018 that we should dispute. And this, to me, was an opportunity to participate actively and not just study passively or at a distance, a large-scale project with actual political impact, with actual political weight, and kind of experience the politics of producing the knowledge about the Amazon. I don't know how successful that will be, but I'm actually doing what I was claiming I should be doing in 2018. I'm actually doing this now, and it is a very disputed, very much negotiated process. There's a lot of constraints, and we can talk about if the gains are actually worth, the kind of science that I can do there. But it is always difficult when you're the only social scientist and people just don't understand what you're talking about or what your questions are, the legitimacy of your questions, how they are even interesting and scientifically speaking. But that's not only the social scientists. When I was participating in these discussions, the modelers were always complaining that they didn't have a place in the discussions in the project. So they were celebrating that, oh, finally we have a working package for ourselves. So it's kind of interesting to see how, I would see modelers as very much hard scientists, but the biologists or the ecologists maybe don't see them in the same light. So there's internal disputes that are interesting to look at in how the modeling relates to the biology, for example. And so, after all this, there's a lot of potential questions that can be asked. Like I said, this is the first time I'm testing this material, and I'm still at the start, kind of grasping what this all means, what the FACE technology is, what the project is. The project is at its very start. So, like I said, one of the hypotheses I want to test is how will the project interface with policy? I'm sure it already is, but how will that happen once there's actual data from the project, once it has the legitimacy? It is still kind of cloudy. The institutionality of the project is still not defined. So there's a lot to go in terms of materializing the project. Will it be reinforcing patterns like Mariana Lawson, an anthropologist who is studying science policy interface? Scientists in Brazil tend to see, or politicians, in Brazil tend to look at the Amazon as a national security question, as an issue of, the foreigners want to take hold of the Amazon, want to occupy. So, all these big science projects funded by the UK, by Germany, how will politicians, the military, or even the scientific community relate to this? Will it change? Will this pattern of seeing the Amazon as a national security question change? Will they be heard? Will scientists have actual dialogue instead of just being kind of brushed aside? Will these models that will emerge help co-produce policy economics? And will they have impact in these politically charged disputes about land use, agriculture, preservation. In Brazil, land use, not just the Amazon, is a very violent and very central issue in politics. The agro, as we talk about in Brazil. So agriculture produces is usually seen nowadays as the richest, kind of the most important economic sector in Brazil. So they have a lot of weight in the economy, in politics, and the Amazon relates directly to this because the agriculture kind of frontier is moving north. The energy producing frontier is in the Amazon. Minerals, all of this is very politically charged, and how will this kind of relate to how scientists are seeing the Amazon, how diplomacy is producing specific views of the Amazon. And again, another kind of absent issue is how will indigenous knowledges, traditional groups, urban populations, how are they going to be integrated, if at all, into the project? So they have a whole subset of questions. We developed this on adaptation. Will we be able to actually develop fieldwork to see adaptation? Will this be taken into account in the project? We were talking about grants. So the grants follow certain logic, and usually to get a grant for this is a lot harder than getting a tower built in the middle of nowhere. So how will they participate in the production of these futures? We have a lot of questions that we want to ask and things that we want to study in the umbrella of the social environmental working package, but doesn't mean that that will be actually implemented. So yeah, that's what I had prepared. I hope that was interesting, and thank you so much for listening.
Okay, so we can open to the questions, thoughts, clarifications. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I really enjoyed the presentation. It's also like bring very closely to some of the stuff I've been engaging with. One of the questions I have is, I'm curious about why you went for this idea of theoretically for the experimental system, when in fact, like, I think of what you do is sort of like very Latourian in the sense of laboratory life, Latourian. I'm not sure what this idea of experimental system adds to the actual study. Because even like Latour talks about how the laboratory not only produces new entities but also stabilize them, turn them into also like papers, glass, stuff like that. It's immutable model. So I'm not sure why this concept of experimental system actually brings to the study. The other question is about, like, I was wondering, while you were also linking with this idea of experimental system, like this, it seems that the experimental system is something that like, it's kind of materializes like the setting where these questions can be asked. I was wondering, like, what is the experimental setting for people like us, And if we don't have it, like, and you can clearly see a differential, like, differences between social sciences and natural science in the spectacularity of the sort of experimental setting. You say that this is a very important aspect of it. So is the lack of relevance of the social sciences partly related to our inability to produce this kind of like spectacular experimental systems, or is it the other way around? That power and relevance comes first, and then when you have it, you can actually build this spectacular kind of experimental system where you can persuade people that this is important. So yeah, these two comments, like, first is about why this is, why is this concept so relevant, and the other one is, how would this experimental system concept apply to people like us, like social scientists? how this connects with these hierarchies of language.
Yeah, great questions. Should I answer?
Yes, why not?
About let me go to the second question first. I think Karen Norsatina, is that how you say it? She talked about the experimental setup of social science in one of her books. I think we do have experimental setups just like any other. I mean, this is a laboratory, and we have
Performatively by name.
performatively like any other laboratory.
Spectacularly.
But like any other laboratory, it's not different than a biology lab where, we have our own kinds of performances, our coffee mugs, our tea, the common room, and different countries have different setups. So I think it's the same. Theoretically speaking, we can look at this just like we can look at any other. But your question about the spectacle, I don't know how to answer, it's kind of the egg or the chicken, which comes first. But I do think our inability to produce spectacle also affects our social scientific ability to impose power. Even though we have a lot of impact in a lot of real world situations, just look at, in Brazil, recent, contemporary Brazil, one philosopher was able to influence a whole new kind of fascism. So somebody thinking alone with a book and writing books and presenting ideas has a lot of impact, even though it's not the same kind of spectacle. But their ability, some sciences produce certain kinds of spectacles that are relevant for obtaining funds and for public imagination. I think that makes a whole lot of difference in how they're seen by the public, which means they are seen differently by politicians, by people defining budgets. And I think for the Amazon Fest, it's very clear that the spectacle is a part of the strategy to obtain funds, obtain legitimacy, and impose on the existing debate about the Amazon. I mean, how would this get built in the first place? Of course, you had people believing in the project, you had people, powerful people, Carlos Nobre, which was a very powerful meteorologist with connections to politics, also believed in it, invested in this, his enthusiasm. So it doesn't come by chance, but the way that the infrastructure is also seen as something relevant. So we will build new labs. We will have new innovative and not just results, but actually innovative setups, new labs, a new building for the IMPA Institute. I think all of this makes a difference.
Can I add something? Because when you were answering, I was thinking about John Law's after method, where he talks about the performativity of social science as well. And I think we also produce, I agree with you, we also produce things we produce surveys that circulate and impact on people. But at some point, I think the social sciences are given up on performativity somehow. And we have retreated from that. And I think to me, the answer is precisely not only to become more performative, but also more spectacular in the way we perform social science as well. We need to produce, I think, focus more on this performative side. And also the spectacle, which I think, at least producing these nice images, these nice aesthetics, maybe you can see now social scientists going to the performance, the arts, the museums, anthropologists have performed their knowledge in music. But maybe for me, the answer is to embrace this performativity, which we already do, but also in the more spectacular way. And I'm not sure whether funding has a lot to do, or the lack of it has something to do with it. But I also think that we have given up on this somehow, spectacularity.
I don't know. I'm talking from the point of view of someone in Brazil, but I think social scientists in Brazil, I don't know if that's true outside, the performance is precisely to be away from it all, to be detached. That's the performance people invest in, and to be able to critique without being part of it. So I'm an outsider in my body language, in my clothing, in the way the institute is different. It's kind of shabby. In Campinas, for example, it's not flashy, new kind of laboratories. For me, this is very new, very flashy in terms of comparing to Campinas. So we don't have this in the social science department, but because I work in the Geosciences Institute, I have better kind of laboratories and rooms. So I think the performance people have chosen in some communities is exactly being detached. And this idea of kind of going and dealing directly with other kind of sciences is still problematic. It's still kind of painful because it's noisy, it's hard. People don't really take you seriously a lot of the time. I don't know. I agree that we should maybe do other kinds of engagements publicly in terms of maybe also like people do our performances, and that makes a difference as well in terms of bringing topics to the public and convincing people that this is interesting. I think we should do more of that, but I don't know if we can do those kinds of large scale infrastructure performances.
So carrying the questioning this conversation exactly and asking a bit about your performances.
Okay.
I mean, I think that the question of whether power comes first or whether the performances come first, the answer to that question really emerged out of your answer and also in your theoretical uptake of co-production, because obviously in these cases, the one doesn't come first to the other. You are enabled to perform by a certain amount of power that you might have, right? But those performances are very important for garnering more power and creating networks of people and all of this stuff and networks of power and money and all that stuff, as you said, right? But there's also an element to which, like, we're talking about scientists as being very powerful and biologists and all of these people that are moving all of this money. But then also in the same position as you have been talking to them, interviewing them, you always have to remember that they also see themselves as incredibly unpowerful. Like, what do you mean we're powerful? What do you think you're doing? And then so this is also like the relativity of all of these power things and all of this in these systems. And so also in this moment in which you're invited into the room to be on the steering committee of this, right? You are both performing a particular kind of role, right? Where you set aside your critical gaze on ecosystem services a little bit and your critical gaze on the, capital entanglements of everything in the Amazon and how science works, right? And you're operating in a constrained environment of like what you can do and what you can recommend, but you're still interested in being at the table. You're doing a kind of performance there.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
But so in these moments, when you're asked, and my question is, what are the expectations of your performance that are situated in this project? When you're asking about what kind of political engagements will the project have? What kinds of policy effects will the project have? Is your position, as I have been a million times, oh yes, we need a social scientist because you do science communication, you do this. So like your role is also prefigured by the expectations of scientists who feel like they're not powerful at all. And they need the kind of power that you can singly perform as a social scientist for them, that they don't otherwise, in their heads, in their positionality, have access to, right? So what sort of dynamics in the project are you engaging with there, and how are you negotiating that?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you're saying. They see themselves as maybe outsiders in terms of we want to do this, but we don't have the money to do this. We need to kind of fight for even though they're very senior people with very long careers, very successful careers, they see themselves as not powerful in a lot of times. And they see the social science component or the social environmental as a way to have more legitimacy with the public, not only public communication, but telling people this, the changing atmosphere will impact people severely. We need to, and that's why this matters. And when I'm at a meeting, so I was at a meeting with the rector of Unicampi, and he chose me to go with him. And a lot of times he wants me to go because of the way I talk maybe, or because I talk about the social kind of component, and that kind of gets people's attention in a different way. So he does use this all the time. And of course, that may be why they want a social environmental component. And I'm thinking, as you were saying, I'm thinking, well, why me and not somebody else? Because maybe of the way I've been doing my connections with environmental scientists in Brazil from my previous research. So I kind of know a network of people that got me into a place where I could be approached by this guy who didn't know me directly, but he maybe knew somebody who knew me, and then I was able to be kind of captured. So yeah, it happens all the time, that performance of, we are worried about the social impacts. We are worried about, people going hungry because of this. We are worried about, people living by the river who are losing their land because the river is kind of destroying the, people use, they plant their small kind of, the crops that they plant are near the river. If the river, there's too much rain, too little rain, that affects severely, directly a lot of people. So all of these things, I kind of provide that kind of talk for sure. And it gives them a different kind of, it's not just a tower in the middle of nowhere. Because the first thing people think about is what you were talking, like when I talked to you the first time, but they're just polluting the Amazon. And that's the first thing people think about. People are questioning, are there indigenous people going to be affected by the CO2? Even though there's nothing like around for miles and miles. But that's what people imagine that's going to happen. And they are, and I told them, like, you need to take that seriously. You can't just say people are stupid. You have to kind of counter this, taking them seriously. People will imagine these kinds of things. And they've been questioned by indigenous leaders about destroying the forest and destroying the spirits of the forest. And they have a whole set of arguments developed to kind of counter this. But it's something that they're fully unaware of, that they don't know how to navigate how people expect. So that's what we do.
You get involved in creating the very sort of imaginaries and how those imaginaries are
Sure.
that you're studying. You're studying imaginaries, and at the same time, you're helping to make them, spread them, and like test them in the world in a way.
So yeah, that's one of the things that I'm kind of at a loss. How do I study this and be a part of this? Because in anthropology, we talk about this all the time. You're part of the phenomenon and you're studying this. And there's all kinds of strategies to do this. But in this kind of setting, because it is so constraining. The idea of ecosystem services is so like violent to me in terms of the way that they reduce things to service and providing service, providing benefits. And to me, it's kind of economicize everything. And for an anthropologist, it seems like, no, you have to go beyond this. So I'm kind of carving a space within the social economic package to do STS research. That's my strategy for now. But I think I have, because there's, in the new science plan, there's a science policy interface component. So I can hire STS people to produce knowledges about this. And I hope that they can be more critical than I can, for example. A postdoc will be very critical and I can't be, because I have to be like, kind of defending the project somehow. Because that's strategic. I may be committing a huge mistake by being part of this, and I'll find out in a few years. But
It's too late.
once it's too late. But I'm old. I mean,
That's
my
why
expert.
Dave hired me on the RRI practice project. She can criticize biodesign, I can't.
You actually publish a paper criticizing them. Okay, more questions. We have people connected online. If you have questions, just let us know.
Nobody else had.
Okay. Is Serena and Sebastian connected? Any question? No? From more information, more.
Something else, like, just thinking back, like, I think that you mentioned this feeling of not being, and that's something I was thinking about while I was listening to your presentation. So you talk about the feeling of, like, of scientists themselves of not having as much power as we sort of describe. And but I was thinking, like, when I was listening to you, I felt like, why are you using the word scientist so confidently in the context of this word? Like, when in fact later on you sort of said, okay, but who is a scientist? It's not like, it's not that clear, and it's something that is also part of the negotiation. Who is a scientist and who is a modeler technician? And I think part of the, but then I think you still use this word, the scientist, as something that is kind of a given.
Yeah.
But then, like, I was thinking, because what Tess was saying is like scientists feel powerless because, in fact, like, there are a lot of agencies there that are hidden when you use the word scientist. And you might be a social scientist involved with the project, but there might be other agencies that are also informed by the social sciences or economics that are not recognized as scientists, but yet are very powerful in terms of shaping this, what is going on there. I'm talking about like economies that might be like making choices about what is economically viable budgeting, like this is how this stuff is allocated. So maybe like, I don't know, maybe like if you drop the category scientist and then you talk about expertise and knowledge, a different picture might surface. And these other like, hidden agencies can surface and become more obvious. Like, and the scientists, in fact, might not be as important or as protagonists as they are in your narrative. Like maybe they have a more like a kind of secondary.
I think that's a great question. I think I've been using this uncritically, just every, scientist.
I didn't mean critically, but.
No, I'm saying it's uncritically because I'm supposed to be critical about what a scientist is and an expert or whatever. But I do need to think about this. I'm not really sure so far because it's such it's a large number of people involved between the PIs and the students and.
How many?
Maybe 50 people, I think.
50.
Just directly involved.
UK and Campinas.
Between everybody, all the countries. Because we did a meeting in Manaus to kind of, that's when I took the pictures and all of the working packages and, just the PIs and one or two technicians, it was like 30, 40, 50 people. So I haven't really started the ethnography. This is my kind of personal experience coming in the project and just being an active participant. So I want to start being an ethnographer. That's when all these issues have to be more carefully kind of debated. What's a scientist? What's an expert? And interestingly, there's no economist so far, which is usually what you see. You always see an economist doing budgeting and they have a lot of legitimacy in terms of environmental science research. It used to be called social economic. We managed to kind of change it to social environmental because of the politics of our little group, which I can't, there's time now, but it's an interesting kind of specificity. But I didn't answer your question about the first question about environmental system, experimental system. I think I'm still also captured by the grandiosity of the infrastructure, but also I'm captured by the idea of an experiment. And how do we incorporate the idea of futures into this kind of research? Because it is a huge laboratory, a laboratory setup. I think it's not just the Latourian ideas of associations, but the way he talks about making futures or making certain questions possible, I think it still might be productive theoretically. But again, I think as I begin to do actual ethnography and I focus either on the scientists or on the science policy interface or some other thing, maybe I'll drop this, but right now it seems to make sense to take, just to allow me to theorize this experience of going into a huge laboratory. Just the idea of the Amazon space is still kind of daunting in terms of, how do we talk about this? And I think I wanted to go back to experiment and then the experimental situation, because it seemed to be adequate just to make sense of this whole infrastructure that was built. And the way they want to produce knowledge. So that's why I think it, but I might be like, again, I might be just being captured by the spectacle of the infrastructure, which is very easy because once you go there and you go up the crane, it's very beautiful and very like your bodily sensation. It's incorporated this sensation of being in something very grandiose, not just the forest, but the towers is a bit kind of overwhelming. I don't know if you've ever been to the Amazon at all. If you go, like everything is everything is large scale. The nature is very large scale. The rivers are like the trees and the amount of biodiversity. So everything at that scale is still kind of, I'm very captured by this, just like they are. I think it's kind of a shared feeling of being captured by everything being so grandiose. Exactly.
Okay. But more conversation during these days. You will be with us until Friday, right?
Yes.
So feel free to approach Marco and make questions about also maybe a specific methodological question. We have some PhD students here that are doing like ethnography at different levels. So if you, Marco is great on methods as well. So we're teaching lots of methods, no?
Yes.
So if you want to have a coffee with him and asking,
Yeah, please feel free.
specific, like how to engage with scientists, how to make an interview, so how to make sense of the data that you are crunching.
And this is just I wanted to talk about this because it's the beginning, but there's other things I've been doing. So I have done, because this seems so incomplete and so kind of speculative. I don't know if people are like, exactly. That's how I feel like.
So this will be the best moment to start doing an ethnography with your project.
Yeah.
In the beginning and see how it's served
Yeah.
out.
Exactly. Exactly.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I don't think you have.
Till Friday.